Hey everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and today I want to teach you how to use any synthesizer. Whoa, that's a big claim, right? Oh my god, every synthesizer, how can you say that? Well, realize that 90% of all electronic music gear out there uses the same controls. The layout is just often different, but the architecture behind it is very often the same. So today I want to refresh what that architecture looks like. I want to offer you a synth workout, like a checklist of how to get familiar with any synth so that you can immediately feel at home when you are presented with a new synth. And 3 at the end, I just want to do a bonus sound design tutorial, a little advanced synthesis technique. More about that later. So without further ado, let's go into chapter 1, a recap of the theory. Before we go any further, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider signing up for one of our classes on Underdog Brussels. We are an online music school, not just a YouTube channel. Okay, so the theory, how does any synthesizer even work? Well, most synthesizers follow the logic that's called subtractive synthesis. It means that you have a sound that's a bit overwhelming and too big, and then you cut away from that sound to make it work in your song. I did a longer video that explains this slower and more detail, so check that one out if you have the time. Otherwise, I'm just going to recapitulate it here real quickly. The basic function of every synthesizer works like this. You have an oscillator that makes a big sound. That oscillator then goes into a filter, which shapes that sound to be a less impressive version of itself. And then that filter runs into an amplifier, which shapes the volume of the sound. The amplifier is the last stage. After that, it comes out into your ears. So just 3 stages to think about, really. There's the oscillator, the filter, and the amplifier. Whenever you hit a key on your keyboard, a few different things happen. First of all, the oscillator changes its pitch to correspond to the key that you're pressing. Then the amplifier and the filter both change in response to that to let some more of the sound through. They do this using envelopes. Envelopes are just slightly more complicated ways of providing an on-off switch. It's a gradual on and a gradual off switch. To give any envelope its shape, you just need to understand 4 terms, which is attack, decay, sustain, and release. If you understand those 4 terms, you can shape any sound by controlling the way its amplitude or its loudness evolves over time and how its brightness or darkness evolves over time thanks to the filter. This is it. This is 90% of all synthesis done right now. The only other theoretical thing that's worth knowing is that you can also include something called an LFO, which is a low frequency oscillator, which is just a signal source that slowly evolves over time, and you can map it to any parameter in your synth so that you can give it some movement. Usually you'll map it to the filter to slowly open and close the filter in a more organic way. Overall, this is what the diagram looks like. You can print this off, hang it above your bed. It's all the theory you need to know to get started with synthesis. Now let's move from theory to practice, and I'll show you, if you're presented with a new synthesizer, how to find out where all these controls are. Let's jump into Ableton. Okay, so in practical terms, there are just a few controls that you need to find on your synthesizer. It's not an endless list of controls, it's a very manageable list. So let's just go over them as a checklist, okay? First, you find your oscillator. On your oscillator, you want to be able to select the oscillator's octave and also what waveform it's generating. Different waveforms influence the sound at the source, so it's worth trying out sawtooth waves, square waves, anything like that. And that's it. At first, that's all you need to know about oscillators. Then find yourself the filter. The filter has a cutoff frequency. It has a resonance amount. How resonant is that filter? A more resonant filter kind of goes more like wow wow rather than bow bow. It's a more nasal sound. Then how much does the envelope affect the filter? Whenever you hit the key on the keyboard, how much does the filter open and close influenced by the envelope? So that's usually just described as an envelope amount. And then you find the envelope that's affecting the filter and you look at the ADSR of that, the attack, decay, sustain, release. If you got that, your filter's done. We can move on to the next thing. The amplifier, also very easy. The amplifier is probably the easiest one. It just has attack, decay, sustain, release. It's a volume control. Then on your synth, what's worth checking out is what does it sound like with reverb and delay. Maybe they're already built into the synth. You can check that out. What other built-in effects exist? Try them all out and see if you can find an LFO somewhere and make that LFO influence the filter cutoff, and try then speeding up and slowing down the LFO rate to make it go faster and slower. Then feel what everything sounds like when you play low on the keyboard, when you play high on the keyboard, when you hold a long note, when you play a bunch of short notes. If you've completed this little workout, you now basically get the synth. You understand it. Now all you've got to do is use it. So to try using it, try making a few different synthesizer formulas. A few that I could suggest are: make a warm, sustained, deep bass line, make a resonant 303 acid sound, make a plucky lead sound, and make a long, sustained atmospheric sound with a long attack and a lot of reverb. So this is your basic synthesizer workout. It's how you get familiar with the controls of a synthesizer. A lot of modern flagship synths can do a lot more than this. You can map anything to anything. You can make anything change anything. You can create super complicated sounds. However, when you're just learning the beginning of synthesis, consider finding yourself a slightly more limited synthesizer, which can still produce powerful sounds, and get intimately familiar with the controls on a limited synthesizer. And then when you're confident with that, consider then moving on to another synth that has other options that you desire. To find a limited synth that works for you, all you've got to do is look in modern history to see what the artists that you respect have been using. And a lot of them, let's be honest, have been using a limited set of classic analog gear, some iconic synthesizers that you can get in plugin format today. A good example of this is Roland, whose iconic sounds have influenced dance music from the very beginning. If you look at the Wikipedia page of almost any Roland product, you're gonna sadly see the words, "It was a commercial failure." A lot of the Roland synthesizers that were implemented back in the day didn't match the expectation of the market at the time, and so they didn't have commercial success. However, later on, they were reimagined, or should we say rediscovered, by dance music pioneers who put them to good use, creating electronic music that we know and love today. Thankfully, Roland has also moved into the 20th century, or are we in the 21st century? Luckily, Roland has kept up with the times and have produced digital versions of their analog synths, so we can use one of these iconic models to learn the basics of synthesis. And sure, these synths can't do everything, right? They can't do everything that the most modern synths can. However, they can do most of it and the most important stuff of it. So use them to learn. So let's do it right now on the Roland SH-101. This is a nicely limited synthesizer. It's a bit raw, and that's why we like it. So imagine you jump into a synthesizer, you open up a new interface like this, and you don't recognize any of the controls. Don't panic. Remember the basic architecture. We're looking for an oscillator, a filter, and an amplifier. And really, the key to that is looking for the letter O, F, and A. And here you can see that there is the VCO, the VCF, and the VCA. That stands for voltage controlled oscillator, voltage controlled filter, and voltage controlled amplifier, because that's how it was implemented electrically in the analog gear. So the terminology has kind of followed its way into the digital domain. If you see under the VCO, the oscillator section, there are a couple of controls that relate to the oscillator. Then you've got the VCF, some controls for the filter, and the VCA, some controls for the amplifier. Just the regular three parts that we saw in our subtractive architecture. Pretty simple, right? So if I hit a few notes on the keyboard, you're going to hear something like this. Now, this is a very high, shrill, intense sound, and one of the things you can do on the oscillator is move down the octave. Cool. All right, and then the other thing in our checklist was to change the waveform. And close to the oscillator, you can see here a couple of waveform shapes. You can see square waves, sawtooth waves, and something called sub-oscillator. Let's turn everything down that we don't want and just turn up the sawtooth wave. Sounds pretty good to me. Great, that's everything we need to know. We now understand how the oscillator works here. Let's move on to the filter. In the filter, you can see here that there is the cutoff frequency of the filter. So we can close this to make the filter sound darker. So we can change the resonance of the filter to make it more nasal. And here is the parameter called env, which just means envelope amount. So how much does the envelope affect the filter cutoff? So here we've set it to the maximum, so the envelope really opens up the filter quite far. Now down here you can see ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. Just like we saw in our training, how long does it take the filter to open and to close? So let's program something like a little pluck sound by moving down the sustain and moving up the decay a bit. So as you can now see, every time that I hit the key, the filter opens up and closes again with very high resonance, which makes this kind of squelchy sound. Pretty nice. But with this, we have understood everything that we need to understand about filters. Sweet. Let's move on to the amplifier. Even simpler. Under the amplifier, the VCA, there is just the ADSR envelope and we're good to go. So we keep the sustain up and maybe we give it a bit of release so that the sound doesn't cut off when we let go of the keyboard. Simple. Now we're done. Now let's look at effects. How about when we add some reverb and some delay to this synth? So pretty cool, pretty cool. Suddenly we get a much richer timbre. And something specific about this synth is that there's also a bit crushing effect, which gives this gnarly digital noise. Check it out. Pretty weird, pretty weird. If you like it weird, this is a godsend. Now, I've turned down the reverb and delay and set all the settings a bit more towards the medium, and I want to show you the LFO. The LFO is here on the left. It's called modulator in this case. It's often called somehow modulation source or something like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to map it to the filter. We're going to set this thing here with VCF. We're going to set it up and we're going to see what happens. You see how on a regular basis now it opens and closes, and we can now move the rate of the LFO up and down. You can speed these things up and down. Amazing. The last thing that I think you might want to see in this synth is the portamento or glide function, which just means that it takes a longer time to get from one note to another. Especially in monophonic synthesizers like this one, where you can only play one note at a time. Glide is a really cool feature. So you turn this up and then you play higher notes. There we go. We've completed the synth workout. I now feel like I understand how this synthesizer works and I can get pretty much the basic synth patches out of it. Let's really quickly make the 4 synth recipes that I was talking about. The sustained low bass. What we need is a low note. Let's say that sounds about right. Let's bring down the filter. Let's create a little plucky start of the sound, so bring it down like this. Love it. And then keep the release open and make the sustain of the filter not completely 0. So there we go. Pretty sweet, sustained bass line. Done. Next sound, let's reinitialize the thing. Next sound is a squelchy acid bass line. All we need for that is to play a kind of a medium pitch. Let's play this, yeah. And bring down the frequency. Again, make it like a pluck, but make it really resonant. So here we go. Cool, there you go. Acid synthesizer, pretty much ready. A simple pluck sound. Let's reinitialize. Play it relatively high. Make sure that the filter also is set to a pluck sound, kind of nice, a little bit of release, bit of delay. Perfect. Little pluck sound. Now let's reinitialize for the last one, which is the long, drawn out, long attack, long reverb, atmospheric sound. So it would sound like something like, sounds about good. Huge reverb, huge delay. with a little bit of movement maybe. There we go. And cool, that's our 4 synth recipes done. There are still a lot more synth recipes in the world, but if you can do those 4, you understand how your synthesizer works. Now from here, where do you go next? What other synthesizers offer which advantages? Well, there are a few obvious ones that we need to talk about. First of all, many synths offer multiple oscillators. With multiple oscillators, you can detune them against each other, and that creates beautiful new possibilities for synth recipes like the Supersaw, the Hoover, and the Reese bassline. Those are really common techniques that you want to be able to do on your synth probably as well. Then, this was a monophonic synthesizer. You probably also want to be able to have access to a polyphonic synthesizer where you can play multiple notes at the same time. That allows you to make chords, that allows you to create harmony and do slightly more complex things. More advanced synths also have more complex routing abilities, so you can route the LFO to pretty much anything that you like. You can have all really complicated things working either through patching cables like in Yuhi's Basil, or using something like a mod matrix on Ableton's Wavetable or Pigment's mod matrix. A lot of synthesizers that are called wavetable synths, they work like this, but for the oscillators they have these really gnarly options that create really weird waveforms like human voice waveforms and things like this. Pretty cool to play with those. There are synths out there that are called FM synthesizers, but actually they take us a little bit away from this architecture, so let's not talk about them right now. That's maybe for a specialized video. The same goes for things called physical modeling synthesizers. They kind of simulate how you hit an object with a stick. Also a bit too outlandish for this tutorial right here. Do a little bit of research about what exact machines your musical heroes have been using, because some essential sounds are really associated with a particular piece of gear, like for instance the Roland 303 acid bass line or the Korg M1 synthesizer and sampler. Having a synth like this in the physical domain, so actually having a real synth in your hand with really like seductive buttons to turn, is very, very fun and a good workflow thing to do, and certainly lets you appreciate the nuances of how these parameters work well together, but it's not essential because also a lot of the digital synths sound as good as the analog equivalent. Now, I told you in the beginning there was one advanced technique I wanted to show you, so let's get into it really quickly. It is the concept of self-oscillating filters. If you turn up the resonance on a filter so high, really, really high that it's screaming, what you can really do is just turn off all your oscillators and leave the filter to scream as if it was its own oscillator. Weird, right? But let me show you here. So I reinitialized everything, and what we do is, this is what the regular oscillators sound like. I can turn down all of that, all of the oscillators. So no sound is coming through now when I try to play notes. But what we're going to do is we're going to set the envelope of our filter to 0. We don't want the envelope to affect the filter frequency cutoff at all. We want to bring down the frequency to somewhere in the middle, and then we're going to turn up the resonance until it starts to scream. Now, do be careful a little bit with your ears on this one because the volume can jump very quickly. So let's try it. There we go. Now, when I move the frequency around, it's pretty wild, right? Now, if we set this keyboard modifier, what will happen is that the frequency cutoff will follow our keyboard up and down the keyboard, and so we can play notes. So check this out. So this filter is now acting like an oscillator. Crazy, right? It really comes into its own when you add a little bit of glide to it. So check this out. Excellent. And if you want an example of that in practice, just check out Jamie XX's Gosh video. Near the end, you can hear almost exactly this, probably with a bunch of reverb, bunch of delay. And voila, that is an intermediate sound design technique that you can take away and try in your house. But as I said, mind your ears, resonant filters can get loud really quickly. Let me know if you found this helpful in the comments. Watch one of my other videos here. Stay producing, be good to one another, and bye-bye.